Chapter 10. Jungle Trails. No diversion was more welcomed, nothing so exhilarated us missionary women, as a call to us from someone in need. The first such emergency that I remember came on a Sunday, when word reached us in a morning meeting of a Colorado woman with malaria. After lunch, Doreen and I saddled up the two old nags, hers and Barbara's, with such tack as we had. For people who had no mode of transportation other than horseback, we had given far too little care and thought to our equipment. There was only one blanket, which was put on whichever horse had the worst saddle sores. There was one pair of stirrups, which Doreen said I must use, since I had not done much bareback riding. Only one horse had a halter. One of the cinches had been mended with a piece of jungle vine, and both of us used a frayed length of rope for a bridle. To the Colorados, whose horses were sleek and well fitted out, we were certainly a poor show. It was a rare sunny afternoon. We had very few of these, for the deep hollow where we lived between the Pacific Ocean and the Andes was usually filled with heavy mist and cloud or rain. There were no mosquitoes or gnats that day. There was a breeze, and the trail was dry. We were very happy, and Doreen had the added pleasure of leading the way for the new and inexperienced missionary. She knew how to saddle the horse, what medicines to take along. She asked me to wear the stethoscope around my neck. She knew the trail, and she knew the family of the sick woman. The great advantage of traveling on horseback instead of on foot was that you were free to look around. On foot, one had to keep one's eyes firmly fixed on the trail in front, watching for snakes, holes to fall into, slippery roots, fire ants, or whatever perils and pitfalls there might be. On horseback, one could leave all that to the horse. As I rode along, I was reminded of the pictures in elementary geography books that depicted the earth during the formation of coal. I had always found these pictures so much more fascinating than those showing factories, dams, resources, raw materials, principal exports, and aerial views of deltas and things. The giant trees, the giant-sized leaves of the lower plants, the tree ferns and air plants, all of these things laced about with lianas made me feel as if I had come not only to a foreign country and a strange people, but to a different eon of time. It would have been appropriate to see a pterodactyl suddenly flap overhead, or the absurd small head of a diplodocus peer on his snaky neck around the bend of a trail. We did see enormous butterflies, some of them 8 inches across. They would float up around the horses as we rode and sail gently off into the dim light of the forest, but never so gently that we were able to catch them. Once I saw a huge purple one with gold on the underside of its wings, so lovely a sight that I thought perhaps I had seen a vision. There were many fallen logs that had rotted along the trail, and in some of them tropical plants were growing, arranged as beautifully as if someone had set them there like window boxes for us to enjoy. We left the main trail and took one so narrow that we often had to lie flat along the horses' necks in order to avoid being lifted up, like Absalom, between heaven and earth. At last we reached the house, built of bamboo slats with a thatched roof and eaves so wide at one end that they formed a covered veranda. We expected to find the sick woman lying near death. In fact, she had gone visiting. The other members of the family whooped and shouted themselves hoarse, and at length she appeared. Doreen's examination indicated that hers was a variety of malaria that gave a high fever on alternate days, and this was not a fever day. In the house there were a slatted table and a platform for sleeping, which had on it straw mats stained red with achiote. Someone fanned up a fire, boiled some water in a small blackened clay pot, and Doreen sterilized her hypodermic needle and syringe and gave the woman an injection. This was a great satisfaction to all, the medicine visibly flowing out of the syringe into the living flesh. The Indians found highly reassuring. On other occasions when Doreen would refuse to administer an injection, knowing that it was not called for, they felt insulted. Why should they put up with these foreigners in their midst if the foreigners were going to be unmanageable? In general, the Indians could be counted upon to answer all calls, to fulfill any petition with good will, but now and then their will was crossed, and the foreigners began to look like enemies. We rode home in twilight, and then starlight, with the weird shadows around us, the squeak of the saddle, the soft sound of the horses' hoofs. the calls of birds and insects giving a voice to the night. I was holding the rope bridle in one hand and 2 eggs that had been given to us in payment in the other, expecting at any moment to crush them in my palm if the horse happened to lurch. We found the lantern lit in Doreen's house when we reached the clearing, and Barbara was making tea. On another occasion, one evening after supper, we heard a Colorado call outside. A man had come to say that his brother had broken his leg and was dying. Would Doreen come? She asked me to accompany her in case she needed help in pulling it to set the bone. Any Indian would have known as much about it as I did, but I was more than willing for the adventure. The 2 Colorados were terribly agitated, for no one they knew of had ever broken a bone, and surely it must be a fatal thing. Doreen reassured them. We quickly donned what passed for riding clothes, packed up a few supplies, and set out. The Indians had brought horses for us. Mine was an excellent little creature that moved smoothly along in the dark, so that although he wore no stirrups, I had no trouble keeping my seat. It was a beautiful night, with the moon showing through lovely clouds. The horses knew the trail, but we had to watch our heads as the horses, following their usual habit, skirted the edge of it. We were joined at the first house we came to by 4 men, all of them well painted, solemn, and silent, conscious of the importance of the occasion. 2 were carrying ever-ready flashlights and went ahead on foot to light the way. The bad part of the journey was yet to come. Not far beyond that house, the 2 Indians on horseback who were in front of us suddenly vanished as if they had fallen into a hole. There was silence, then the sound of a sliding plunge, a crash, the splash of water. The flashlight beams did not reach to the bottom of the ravine, but there was nothing for us to do but follow. Here goes, I thought, hanging onto the back of the wooden saddle and digging my knees into the horse's shoulder blades with all my might to keep from plummeting over his head. I held my breath as we dropped into the blackness. The horse pitched violently from side to side, trying to find footholds as his hoofs hit rocks, holes, or tree roots. When he could hold no more, we slid for what seemed forever. A sudden wrench and he gained a foothold once more, but the momentum sent us tearing and twisting into the river with a great splash. It was shallow, and we were soon across it, and struggling up the steep bank on the other side, my fingers wound tightly into his mane to keep from slithering down over his flanks. "There are 3 more of these," announced one of the Indians laconically, and we braced ourselves, not knowing how soon to expect the next. His count was wrong, however. There were 12 more, some worse than the first, but I began to trust the little horse and to get some of the thrill of riding a roller coaster. At about 11 o'clock we reached the house, where quite a company had gathered, eager and quiet, wondering what the foreign senorita might make of the situation, expecting that death would be the likely end of it all. A sobbing, moaning heap by the fire proved to be a man of about 20. He had broken the leg while riding a horse down one of those ravines. He howled when Doreen lifted the filthy cloth that covered the leg, but it was a simple fracture, and he had actually pushed the bone into place himself. It did not look as though we could do more, at least by the light of the fire and flashlight, so Doreen gave him a shot of morphine and told his family we would stay until morning and see about him then. He went quickly to sleep, and we sat by the fire listening to the puffing, halting sounds of the Safiki language. I had my notebook with me, as always, and jotted down a few words. Most of those in the house had come from a distance to see what would happen, and Doreen thought the talk would probably go on most of the night. She told our host we were tired, and he said that the upstairs platform was ready. We took our ponchos and climbed the notched pole to a split palm platform that was bare except for a heap to one side that we took to be a person. I had not slept on the bare floor before without a pillow, but I slept and woke refreshed at dawn. The heap was a man, still sleeping soundly, but in another corner was a ragged green parrot who sat motionless with his eyes fixed upon us. I fixed my eye on his until he felt it was time to get up. He walked cautiously down the pole from his perch, using his beak to pull himself along, and stepped daintily across the floor, his toes demurely pointed inward, until he reached a neat little package wrapped in banana leaves and tied with a vine. This he examined for some minutes, walking around and over it to judge it from all angles. Then he carefully opened it. With claws and beak, eating the contents, which I could not identify, but which seemed without doubt to be meant for his breakfast. Doreen and I went to the river, a lovely clear flowing stream with smooth brown rocks at the bottom, to wash, and came back to the house, put a bamboo splint on the broken leg, wound it tightly, and then sat until the arrival of a man they called the sub-chief. He told folk tales, surrounded by an attentive group of young men, and we listened, trying to learn and put down on paper some of what we heard. Soon a small boy shyly offered me a banana package, which I undid. Was everyone's breakfast prepackaged, or was this a special service for parrots and visitors? And found it contained 4 boiled eggs, several asados, not quite ripe plantains roasted to a delicious golden brown in the ashes, better than any hot roll I had ever tasted, and bala, the main staple of the Colorado diet, heavy rubbery cylinders made of boiled, mashed, rolled green plantains. A few nuggets of dark brown rock salt were tucked into the packet. Doreen and I ate with great relish, keenly watched by every eye. There was a respectful silence until we finished eating. Then the horses were saddled for us and we started, unaccompanied, for home. The 13 ravines which we had negotiated safely in the dark were far more frightening now. We could see in the daylight how steep was the pitch, how far down the river, how slick the mud. We plunged and rose, clutching alternately at saddle and mane, and finally crossed the last of them. I wondered how the horses were to be returned to their owners. But a few minutes after we reached San Miguel, an Indian appeared, having come on foot, and having timed his arrival exactly. As he mounted one of the horses and rode off into the forest, leading the other, I marveled. There was something so quiet and smooth about the way Indians did things. They knew how things needed to be done in the jungle, and without fuss or explanation they did them. But when we got home, we were in a flap, to use one of Doreen's expressions, having to unpack, to scrape the mud off our legs and bathe, to catch up with work undone, to talk about the night's events, describing for Dorothy and Barbara the awful ride and the bizarre sleeping quarters. But then it is quite likely, I suppose, that the Colorados were talking about their bizarre visitors and their freakish ways. Did you see the way they climbed that pole? Did you see how they ate? They're so pale. They smell so strange. Their teeth are so white. Their lips are so red, they were probably saying.